YouTube. Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and I will read out your question to our speaker. Or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 20 or 30 minutes of questions and go to about 4 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a social media channel on YouTube. This talk is being recorded for that and will be posted shortly after the end of the talk. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access the YouTube channel. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org. Now this afternoon's speaker, and someone I'm really thrilled to have here, Dave Holland is well known as an expert Guadalcanal battlefield guide. He served 8 years in the U.S. Marines as an infantryman, along with over 26 years as a law enforcement investigator. He lived on Guadalcanal for 3 years, walking the ground, researching, and documenting. He is also the owner of a very popular Facebook and YouTube site, Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield. He has appeared in multiple podcasts and shows discussing the Guadalcanal land campaign. He currently lives in Canberra, Australia. I believe it's actually 5 a.m. in the morning his time, so huge. Thank you for joining us to accommodate our schedule. And he returns to Guadalcanal yearly. Guadalcanal's longest fight is a culmination of his years of research and walking the ground, and that's the book he'll be discussing today, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, the pivotal battles of the Matanikau, which focuses on the pivotal battles of this region. The reviews are all top shelf. I'll just read two quickly. Dr. Peter Williams, author of the Guadalcanal Campaign 1942 Myth and Reality, writes, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight is an essential read for military history enthusiasts and scholars of the Pacific theater of World War II. It fills a significant gap in the historical record of the campaign and provides valuable insights into a critical phase of the Pacific War. While Colonel Graham, based in College Station, Texas, writes, short of trekking to the Solomon Islands on your own, this book is as close to Guadalcanal as a reader can get, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave and start showing you some maps.
Thanks, Greg, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss my book and the opportunity to appear on your great show. Yes, it's 5:04 a.m. Canberra time. It's starting to get winter here down under, so it's a bit chilly, so not too bad. I'll get straight into it. I'm not a PowerPoint guy, so I'll just throw a few, or Greg will throw a few photos up there, and I'll use them as discussion points. So a little bit about my background, and Greg spoke about it, and I'll just relate it to why this book came about and from my background. So yeah, I was 8 years in the Marines, and part of that duty was in Canberra, Australia, as an embassy guard. So I always wanted to go to Guadalcanal. So long story short, I met an Australian woman and got married and went back to the States, got out of the Marine Corps. Then we immigrated back to Australia to live. And there I joined the Australian Federal Police. Now, I'm getting somewhere with this. So part of the Australian Federal Police had ongoing peacekeeping mission in the Solomon Islands. And for those viewers and listeners that might know, the Solomon Islands capital is Honiara on the island of Guadalcanal. So I was being a Marine Corps veteran, military history nut, I was destined to put my hand up and volunteer for that mission, which I did. So in 2009, I went for 4 months initially, and there it gave me the opportunity in between operations while I was actually walking the ground and doing patrolling, but it gave me the opportunity to study the ground and scratch the surface, as I call it. So with 2010, 11, and 12, I did short operational stints, and I was always guiding people around and taking the police and the military around who I was there with. But then in 2018 to 2020, I hit the research jackpot, as I call it. I was assigned there, still with the Federal Police, as an advisor for 2 straight years to the Royal Solomon Island Police. And there, that really gave me the opportunity. I mean, I had my own vehicle. I could drive around. I did all the VIP war tours or visits when we'd come in. I had a great commander over there. But it gave me the opportunity to go off the beaten track, so to speak, and study these places that's not in the books, actually verify the information I've read in other books and other accounts. And a lot of times they were correct, but a lot of times they're not correct. And due to my military background, I could study that ground. And what worked in 1942, say, for example, we put a machine gun, would work in 2023. So it really gave me a great appreciation of the campaign. So that's my background of how it gave me the, I guess, knowledge to write the book. So why the book? Why a book on the Matanikau? Why another book on Guadalcanal? So you probably, if you could see behind me, I've got a large shelf of books. I've got 104. Hold on, I think I got 105 Guadalcanal books. So why another one? We were going to be beating a dead horse. But I thought if I was going to write a book, if I was going to bring new information to the table. So when I was over there on Guadalcanal, I remember one time, and it's in the introduction to my book, I was at a U.S. Tour, an Australian Solomon Islands hotel, mainly one of the tourist hotels. And I was there waiting for a friend. And there was a U.S. tour group there, battlefields tour group. And I overheard one of them asking the tour guide, the American tour guide, what happened around here? He goes, not much happened around here. We're going straight to Bloody Ridge. That's where everything happened. And I thought, hold on a minute. So the hotels are located around the Point Cruz area. So the map here on the screen is that arrowhead-shaped thing in the middle, top middle. And I'll give you the orientation in a minute. But it was around that area. And I thought, hold on a minute. This is around the Matanikau front. This is some of those highly fought over areas of the campaign. And I looked out of the window, the hotel, the foyer, and I said, well, the one Medal of Honor happened there. Another Medal of Honor happened there. I said, a lot of stuff occurred here. So why is the Matanikau missed? And then when I was doing my deep dive and studying and walking underground of Guadalcanal, I knew both commanders on both sides, on the commanders on both sides, knew the Matanikau River was the key to Henderson Field. It was a seesaw battle, kept fighting back and forth, and all the counts. Matanikau is always mentioned. They're always either one side's going across it attacking, or the other side's going across it attacking. There were 7 major battles in Matanikau front, and I call the Matanikau front. If you look on the aerial map there, Matanikau River's to the right, Point Cruz to the left. That's roughly a mile-long area. So that was where all the majority of the fighting was in the campaign. Hence the title of my book, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight. 1/3 of all the American casualties killed and wounded occurred here. They fought in this area for 5 straight months. Now the campaign was 6 months. So the Americans started fighting in this area from mid-August until mid-January. So 5 straight months of heavy fighting. The Japanese lost thousands of men in this area. But yet it's relatively unknown to the popular telling of Guadalcanal. And what I was finding, for most people, they think of Guadalcanal, big Marine Navy fight. They landed, they took Henderson Field, they fought the Battle of Alligator Creek, they fought the Battle of Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, Battle of Henderson Field, and it's basically over with. The Army came in, the Marines left, Army just did mop up, and that was it, which was entirely not true whatsoever. There was a lot of heavy fighting, and you'll see in my book that I hopefully debunked the myth of the Army quote mopping up, because it wasn't a mop up. And you'll see in my book too, and I found out in December, which was a big realization for me, in December 43, the fight wasn't over. Both sides were offensively spent. Both sides were just waiting for additional reinforcements to continue the fight. And January was a hard struggle. And then the Army fought around Mount Austin, and it was just by November, it wasn't over. There was a lot of more fighting to be done. And some of the fighting was actually on the Matanikau front. Two more battles on the Matanikau front, which are relatively unknown. So I thought there's a lot of material there for another book. So I think why, I already mentioned bits of it. Why is the Matanikau so important? And I said bits. So I know some of the listeners and viewers will think, what's this guy saying? I can't understand. He's either Australian or he's Alabama. So yeah, had a person ask me one time, they said, are you from Adelaide or are you from Alabama? So I guess it's 30 years of being down under. So I don't want to apologize for my accent, but yeah, I'll try to slow down. Some people find it hard to understand me. Very unique hybrid accent. But anyway, so I won't go into the actual campaign and the background because I don't have enough time. So when the Marines landed, took the airfield on the 8th of August, 1942. So they landed on the 7th, took the uncompleted airfield on the 8th of August. The Japanese garrison, at that time, the Marines had estimated the Japanese garrison to be 5,000 men, including a reinforced infantry regiment, which didn't pan out to be. There were roughly about 2,500 Japanese, mainly labor troops, construction troops, because they were constructing a major airfield and staging base. So when the Americans' naval shells started landing, there was a Japanese commander called Imperial Japanese Navy Captain Monson. So Monson issued orders to grab anything you got and head to the Matanikau River. So if I could get Greg to go to map 1 for me. Yeah, there you go. So this is the orientation for basically what we're talking about. So the circle with the airplane is Henderson Field, and the star to the left is the Matanikau River. So it's 5 miles due west from the airfield or the perimeter. Marines had about a 5 mile long and about a mile and a half wide perimeter there, or three by 1 at that stage. So that's where the Matanikau is set. So Monson gave his orders for his troops to grab 3 days worth of supplies and head due west to Matanikau. So Matanikau is a natural barrier, and there the Japanese were going to regroup and then wait for reinforcements and then take back the airfield. So that was Monson's idea. But the Marines, when they landed, where are the Japanese? They started, where these 5,000 Japanese. So they started rounding up some of the Korean laborers, or mainly Korean laborers, and some of a few Japanese engineers. They started rounding those guys up because they didn't head to Matanikau because they weren't combat troops. They just went in all directions. So Monson had around 350 security troops, or combat troops as they called them, special naval landing force guys. So they're the ones who are concentrated there at Matanikau. So the Marines said there's 5,000. Where are they? We can't find them. So they started running patrols west to try to find these guys. And these patrols were from the 5th Marines, so the 5th Marines Regiment. So they started running into the mouth of Matanikau, around Matanikau, and they started getting into a few heavy patrolling skirmishes. So the word got back that, hey, the Japanese around Matanikau. So that leads us to, like I said, I won't get into the rabbit holes here, but it's all in my book. A guy called Colonel Frank Getchie, who is the division intel officer, colonel, like I said, and he went there on a small patrol, and that's an infamous or famous patrol, which side you look at it, and they were wiped out, apart from 3. And that kind of confirmed to Major General Vandergrift, the division commander, that, hey, the Japanese, this could be where the garrison is. So they formed a battalion-size attack force. And if I could get Greg to go back to map 9. They formed a battalion-size attack force to basically wipe out what they considered the garrison. So the intelligence was there was some, number 9. So the garrison was there, and basically from the 18th and 19th of August, there it is. You'll see the Matanikau there, and those numbers are hill numbers. Now you'll notice the terrain, the hill numbers are on, the hills are barren. Well, that's natural. There are coral ridges and covered with kunai grass. because the topsoil isn't that deep there. So hence trees won't grow there. But in the deep ravines or thick jungle with streams. And also around this area pre-war was a coconut plantation. You'll see photos of Guadalcanal, especially around Henderson Field. There's a lot of coconut trees. So the Lever brothers had hundreds of acres of coconut trees along the northern coast of Guadalcanal there. So that's how the terrain was around the Matanikau region. So go back to the 18th and 19th of August. So the Marines attacked. They attacked a village on the western side. You probably can't see it there, but this is actually the day of the fighting, the 18th of August, when this photo was taken. It's all in my book too. It shows how the first Matanikau. But long story short, they defeated the Japanese there in a classic pincer movement, envelopment, and destroyed what they thought was the majority of the fighting parts of the garrison. And on the 19th of August, at the same time, to the east of the field, which were a Marine captain named Brush run into a Japanese advance party of a Japanese Imperial Army, which led into the Battle of Alligator Creek. So what the Marines were going to do here, they were going to send the reinforced battalion and clean up the rest of the Japanese after Matanikau, but they had to stop because they've got a major threat on their eastern flank. So that leads us into the 21st of August Battle of Alligator Creek. So this is another misconception about the Guadalcanal Campaign. The Battle of Alligator Creek was very important, but it wasn't the first battle of the campaign. Apart from Tulagi, where the Marines landed on day one, this first battle of Matanikau on the 18th and 19th is the first really battle of the Guadalcanal Campaign, but yet it's not really known. So after the defeat at Alligator Creek, that leads us into the Battle of Bloody Ridge, which is in September. And then after the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the defeated Japanese retreated back to the Matanikau, a natural defensive spot. And then the Marines said, well, there's not many Japanese there. The 7th Marines landed. Like I said, I'm going through this very quickly. It's all in my book in a lot of detail. 7th Marines landed under, and then they had a 1st Battalion of 7th Marines and a guy called Puller. So Puller, Edson, a number of them was involved in the second battle of Matanikau. And I won't give you a spoiler, but the other part from saying the Americans were defeated here. They got a bloody nose. Which leads us into the third battle of Matanikau, fought from the 7th to the 9th of October. So that was the one battle I'll put up on a map here very quickly. I think that's map 3 or 4. Great. So I'll give you a bit of lead up to this. So the Japanese after the defeat of Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, yeah, that's it. They knew that the Americans have basically drawn a line in the sand at Guadalcanal, and this is when we wanted to fight, quote, the defensive, decisive battle. So they threw everything they could at it. So the combined fleet, which is the largest fleet since Midway, started coming down. A reinforced Japanese division started coming in, and they had plans. So they knew the American air power was very, they had to destroy it, or they had to suppress it before they could bring in these large transports. Because what they were doing, they're bringing in the nightly Tokyo Express runs, as they call them. They could drop off a limited amount of supplies, a limited amount of men. But to do a large offensive, they had to bring in these transports full of tanks, tons of supplies, thousands of men. But they couldn't unload them at night and get away before the day, because the Americans ruled the day, the sea power. They had control of the sea zones around it from the Cactus Air Force, as the Americans called it, so they could take out any ship. So the Japanese knew they had to suppress the American air power. So how are they going to do it? We're going to use heavy artillery to do it. We're going to land them 10 days before off seaplane carriers, a couple of batteries. And then what we're going to do, we're going to seize the east bank of the Matanikau River. We're going to use that as a firing platform. If we seize the east bank of the Matanikau River, then one, it would serve as a jumping off point from where we get all our forces. And two, we can commence our bombardment of Henderson Field to suppress the airfield. So we have to take that east bank in the Matanikau River because we're only 5 miles away. So that was their plan. And then once they took it, they were going to use that as a jumping off point and proceed straight down the coast and in those northern slopes of Mount Austin to attack the airfield. So that was very key to their plans. So the Americans, Vandergrift, knew he had to take the Matanikau because he wanted to push the Japanese past Matanikau to a place called Kukumbona, which is another 3 miles to the west. And there, that would allow him to have breathing space around the airfield, and plus it keeps the Japanese off balance because Vandergrift had a doctrine of limited defense or active defense, for these limited offenses. This is one of them. So the Americans' offensive was planned for the 7th of October. At the same time, the Japanese had issued orders for the 4th Regiment, the 1st Regiment of the 2nd Division that landed, to seize the East Bank with a limited attack on the 8th of October. So both forces are going to conduct a simultaneous attack, but the Americans beat them to the punch. Now, my book goes in a lot of detail about it, but what I'll say is the Americans beat the Japanese here. They caught them off balance, and they beat the Japanese. And they kept the Japanese from maintaining control of that east bank. So very, very important. To me, the third battle of Matanikau is the most important battle of the Guadalcanal Land Campaign. Once again, it's not as well known, but to me, it's very important for that one reason, to deny the Japanese access to the east bank. So what the Japanese had to do, they had to started firing their guns roughly 8 to 10 miles away around Kukumbona. Now I have in my book, which my book has a lot of firsthand Japanese accounts, which a lot of books don't bring to the table. I think as a former investigator, you can't really investigate a crime unless you speak to both sides. So I thought, well, that's a bit silly to only have the American view of the battles. Hence, I know the Japanese records are hard to get, but I had a Japanese historian, and we've got a lot of good material I could bring to the table. So I incorporate as much as the Japanese side as I can. But there was a Japanese battery commander, and I thought this was very one of many things I learned from studying this. He said he landed, and because they had to fire their 150 millimeter howitzers at such extreme range, they had to use the maximum amount of powder. And because of that, each gun fired about 70 to 80 shells before they started malfunctioning and breaking. It'd be like running your car all the time at high revs, right? You just can't take that pressure. And that was one of the implications. They could not throw a lot of fire down on the airfield as they expected. And what this also did, the Japanese plan, it threw a wrench in their gears. So what they had to do, they had to come up with a new plan. So their new plan was to go south around Mount Austin and through the jungle and come up, hit the American in the southern flank, which led to the Battle of Henderson Field. So I'll go to the next slide, and I'll just show, I think it's 5. So the Matanikau, Battle of Henderson Field, like I said, we don't have much time, but there are 3 elements, and I go into each one of these in my book. They were supposed to be a coordinated, the Japanese supposed to be a coordinated assault. One element was going across the mouth of Matanikau. One was going upstream and cross and try to envelop. And the main element would be hitting basically 5 miles due east and hit around Edson's Ridge. And they're supposed to be all coordinated. All the Japanese attacks on the Guadalcanal, they became 3 piecemeal, uncoordinated, unsupported attacks. So on the 23rd of October, one of these attacks was supposed to be the diversionary attack across the mouth of Matanikau. So here is a great photo. This shows you the mouth of Matanikau. Now, I failed to mention this. There was only one way across Matanikau. There was a pre-road called the coastal track, or the government road. It ran roughly around the coastal track. But the only place it crossed the Matanikau was at the mouth at low tide, the sandbar. And here we're looking at the sandbar. We're looking due west. So this is the American side and Japanese on the other side. And that's Point Cruz in the far distance. This is an American anti-tank bunker. So that sandbar, I I call it Alligator Creek on steroids. It was more assaults from both sides across that sandbar than any other place in the campaign. You know, hundreds of men died on that sandbar that you're looking at there. But that was the only place you could move tanks, heavy vehicles, or guns across. So that was why it became very important. So the Americans knew the Japanese were there and they're going to do a major assault. And they thought the only place they could really do it was across the mouth of Matanikau. So what the Americans did, they built up the strongest defensive position of the campaign there. Sandbag and log enclosed bunkers, which is a good example here. Anti-tank guns, which is 37 millimeter, 75 millimeter self-propelled half tracks, improvised anti-tank mines on the sandbar, a massive amount of artillery registered, about 44 guns registered on the other side in 50-yard ladders, 800 yards long by 400 yards wide. In fact, Pedro Deval, the American division artillery commander, said it was an instrument of destruction. So that's where they expected to attack. So on the 23rd of September, the Japanese did attack, and they led with 9 tanks. And I have the account by the history of the first independent tank company. It was in Japanese. It was translated. And there's some good accounts there that you won't find in the other books about why they were given the, quote, the honor of leading the assault. But only one tank made it. And I had the privilege of getting the diary, unpublished diary of one of the Marines, sitting beside another Marine that used a grenade to take to disable a tank. But if you go to the next slide, Greg, it shows the aftermath. Famous photo. This is the mouth from Matanikau. This is, you can see Point Cruz in the far distance, American side, and this is the aftermath of the tanks when these tanks had been taken out at that stage. So the Americans destroyed the tanks. The artillery wiped out roughly a half a battalion before we could even get out of its assembly points, and that attack stopped. And then I go into in my book about another attack the next night by the second supporting unit on Hill 67 on Matanikau, which features a famous incident by a Marine, a sergeant called not Basin, Mitchell Page. So Mitchell Page, for his actions, he's awarded a Medal of Honor, and I go into a lot of detail about that action in my book. So basically, it takes us down after that battle. We go back to, I think, number 9, Greg. After that battle, like I said before, the popular perception is the campaign was basically over, but it was far from over. The U.S. Army was landing then. So it goes to the 4th Battle of Matanikau. So the Japanese had been hurt quite bad, and they had a whole division strung out in the jungle. So Vandergrift took advantage of that, and on the 1st of November, initiated the 4th Battle of Matanikau. So they kicked off from the east bank of Matanikau, crossed the west, went to Point Cruz there, and fought a heavy action between Hills 78 on the right and Hills 84 on the left. And ended up trapping, after 3 days, what was left of a Japanese battalion and destroying them. But at the same time when this happened, a lot of things in the Guadalcanal Campaign, a lot of times the sea and land campaign interacted with each other. So we had some actions on Coley Point. Some Japanese reported to be landing whole division to the other side of the perimeter at Coley Point, which is 11 miles to the east of the perimeter. So Vandergrift suspended his assault here because he almost was going to go to Kukumbani. You know, they had the Japanese on the run, and they had to respond to that. Hence the Battle of Coley Point. He told these guys in Matanikau to hold 5, so to speak, dig in. And then on the 10th of November, they recommenced this attack. And they brought in the 8th Marines and the 2nd Marines were there, and the 8th Marines. So we're looking at the 2nd Marine Division now, elements, which a lot of people don't even know the 2nd Marine Division was even there. So they started pushing. They were doing very well. Then reports from naval intelligence, you got a massive fleet, because remember, this is about mid-November, massive fleet heading your way. So Henderson Field was always the most important thing. So Vandergrift had to stop his offensive. He didn't want to because he'd gained all that ground and go pull all the way back. But he knew the Matanikau was so important, he still left units, was the 8th Marines, Regiment this space time, holding the bank of Matanikau while the rest of them pulled back to guard the perimeter. So it ended up, those big, large convoy was another attempt. Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, they were defeated. Then the Army was starting to take over, which went into the 5th Battle of Matanikau, which the Army was going to drive in and once again and take it, drive to Cucumbono. So we see almost an all-Army show here, including the 8th Marines. And they really got a bloody nose, and they suffered a pretty hard defeat. They did take the Matanikau, but they got stopped there around the ridges around Point Cruz. So at that stage in November, the Matanikau, both sides were in Americans' hands, but it turned into a stalemate. So that became the Point Cruz line. So basically, the Japanese were on the left-hand side of the ravines there at 84 and 83, and Americans were on 78 to 80. And it turned into something a little like World War I. 6 weeks of no fighting. Well, it was fighting, but no offensive. It was World War I type fighting. With patrols, night raids, mortar skirmishes, sniping. And both sides just hunkered down. They couldn't move. So this whole mopping up bit, no, the Americans couldn't move. The Japanese were dug in. They couldn't move against them. So it went into December. The Army took over. Both sides waited. And then it went into January. And in January, Alexander Patch, the new Army commander, which is commander of all forces then, the 1st Marine Division had left. But the 2nd Marine Division is there. So it's another misconception about Guadalcanal, that as soon as the Marines left, the Army took over, there's no Marines there. In January 43, there was 16,000 Marines still there, fighting hard. And then it leads into the January offensive. So the Army are attacking around the Mount Austin area, which is down to the south there, taking those ridges. And the Marines are holding the coast. And then on January the 13th, the 8th Marines kicked off. And you'll see in my book, the 8th Marines have been there for 6 weeks and had a lot of time to think about how they're going to take these positions. And the Japanese had some very clever defensive positions in there, and I go into a lot of detail in my book. This turned into a very hard fight, but the Marines come up with some innovative techniques. I won't spoil it, but this was probably the biggest eye-opener about this book. And even Colonel John Hoffman, he's a very well-known Marine Army historian, he wrote the foreword of my book, was very surprised at the innovative techniques the 8th Marines were using. These are the 4 runners of the corkscrew and blowtorch techniques that the Marines and Army later used throughout the Pacific Campaign. This is the first use in World War II, and I think in American history, of the flamethrowers on the 15th of January. I go into a lot of detail on that, about how the Marines also use innovative techniques to overcome these defenses. So that's something you won't find in any other book or any other account, how detailed the fighting was in January around the Point Cruz area. So that basically kind of sums it up. I know I went through very quickly, but why is the Matanikau not as well known if it's so much fighting was there? And why is it not as well known as, say, Alligator Creek or Bloody Ridge? I come up with a few theories. One, after the campaign ended in February 43, the Americans turned that area into a huge logistical and training base. And they concreted a lot of areas, they built infrastructure. So they built over the Matanikau battlefields. And unfortunately, too, there's a number of Americans missing today, and Japanese, but American missing today, who are basically under that concrete and under those. I find it very ironic when people go there in the tourist hotels, where it's mainly located in that area, don't even know that there's Americans remains under their feet. I mean, there's been a lot of searches for them, but they're still there. But I think, one, that was the reason, because it was kind of like the battlefield was kind of wiped out. And plus, two, there's no really glorious victories and a good place to reflect for the Americans on the Matanikau. What you see in Matanikau, they suffered 2 defeats, a lot of misery there, a lot of suffering, probably places that people would like to forget and probably wouldn't want to revisit. And plus, two, like I said, Edson's Ridge, Alligator Creek, they're very, very important battles. But in the scheme of the campaign, there were isolated, smaller battles. Very important, though. Don't get me wrong. They're very important. And they're very well preserved. Well, Alligator Creek used to be well preserved, but a couple of years ago the battlefield was destroyed. But I won't get into that. But Edson's Ridge is very well preserved. So a good place for people to come to reflect, to veterans in all throughout the war to come back and have ceremonies there. And it was a very, especially Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, it was a very, very important, heroic fight. It's great to remember and all that. So I think too, the veterans would like to talk about that. And at the time, the newspapers, the contemporary newspapers and newsreels talked about Edson's Ridge and Alligator Creek. And I think the Matanikau just faded from memory, the main battles of Matanikau. So I know they're very short and sweet, but what I do in my book, once again, like I said, I wanted to bring something new to the table. And from all accounts, everyone that's read the book, and I challenge someone to read the book and not find something new. I think because of my investigating background, I looked at this book like a criminal brief of evidence. I couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt, but what I did with most of my facts and my research, I tried to establish the weight on a balance of probability that something occurred. I wouldn't put something in there I couldn't corroborate with another piece of evidence. And I looked at it that way, and people tended to like it very much. And I've been told it's a very easy read because I don't know if it's my Alabama education, but I wrote it the way that I'd like to read it. And I did certain things, like all the Japanese units are in italics, because one of my pet peeves, I'm reading books and all the units are roughly the same. I get confused. And you'll notice I use a lot of hill numbers in it, and that's why I'll throw a few good maps in there with the hill numbers like you see here. So I think that's about really it I can talk about. Probably afterwards I'll think, oh, I should have said this or said that. So I know we got a bit of time for some questions that some people might want to ask. So I'll just open it up to you, Greg, to field some questions.
Yeah, that was
See
great.
what I can.
Really nice job. And you're right, we already have some questions. I'll take a few in the queue, and then Jim, I'll go to you. We've got about 4 or 5 in the queue already, Dave. So from Tim, everyone knows Polar, Carlson, Van de Griff. Who do you feel are the unsung regimental, battalion, and company commanders of these fights?
Well, yeah, so they were all Army. Some of the Army ones really came to the forefront. And I'll talk about Japanese too. But the Army, General Edmund Seabury, he was a brigadier general. He was assistant division commander of the Matanikau division. I thought he impressed me a bit. Colonel Whaling. Now, if you read my book, Colonel Bill Whaling, U.S. Marine Colonel, I call him Mr. Matanikau. He's all over the place. I knew of Whaling. Whaling was a former sergeant in World War I. But Whaling took over. He was an XO of the 5th Marines when they landed. And then he was kind of shut to the side. I call it the September Purges. You'll read my book. The command changed quite a bit. Vandergrift got rid of a few guys, but he retained Whaling. So Whaling formed something called the Scout Sniper Group, because at the time the division was, I'd say they're half trained, because they were supposed to go to New Zealand for 6 months and complete the training. A lot of these recruits had only 5 weeks of basic training. Good quality guys, only 5 weeks. So their patrolling and scouting skills were lacking. So Whaling said, I'll come up with an idea. And what he did, he formed the Scouts and Snipers. So he'd bring these guys in, they'd train them, and they'd rotate a number back to spread the gospel, so to speak, or spread the experience. But Whaling, all the deep research, he's involved in every operation except for the 2nd Matanikau. He's always up front, and he's even though it's not written down on paper officially, I think he's the tactical commander. In fact, I know he's the tactical commander of all these battles. So Whaling was probably the biggest guy that a lot of people don't hear about. Then you got to have H.H. Hannikin, battalion commander, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. And then, yeah, I've got my second book coming out in October. It's called The Forgotten Fight, about the U.S. Army. And the division commander, J. Lawton Collins, is a very impressive guy to me. But yeah, there's a lot. And Major General Kawaguchi on the Japanese side, to me, is the best of that bunch. and a guy called Colonel Nakagawa, which is a 4th Infantry Regiment, was a very impressive fellow to me. And like I said, in my book, I talk about both sides. And I try to, I guess it's my investigator, non-biased, objectable view. I know the Japanese, I have to look past the atrocities and everything else and look at the combat value and what they did on the ground to study to get a true account of the campaign. So yeah, that's how I look at how the Japanese. You can't just have the blinders on and think, well, the Japanese are so bad, I won't study them, because that's not true history. So that's how I do it. I have to be very objectable. But yeah, to answer that question, there was the whaling's probably my biggest guy.
Perfect. And Tim asked when your Army book is coming out, and I think you just answered that.
Yeah, October. It's not a sequel. It's a companion to the book.
Next question from Pete Owen, who's a scholar in his own right, has his own book coming out on the Marine Fighting Squadron 221 in the Pacific, and I think we have him scheduled for the summer. He asked, Dave, great book, loved it. You mentioned General Vandergrift and Patch considered an amphibious envelopment of the Matanikau defenses. Do you have any insight into why they rejected this amphibious envelopment option?
Well, yeah, Vandergrift. Yeah, hi, Pete. Yeah, so Vandergrift initially, I think you might mean Patch. General Patch, and when he took over, they wanted to, in January, it was put to them to do another envelopment. So I think Patch at the time, one was lack of landing craft. Two, the Army, I don't think it was comfortable with amphibious assaults at that stage of the war. They were later. And I think three, he didn't want to drop a unit off to be potentially cut off and isolated. Now, Vandergrift, he used a series of amphibious assaults or even fates. I mean, you'll see the famous one in the second Battle of Matanikau, where they had 1-7, first time 7 Marines, did a amphibious assault around Point Cruz there, and on the photo, and landed and went up to Hill 84, and they were cut off, which led us to the engagement, the mini Dunkirk, where we have Monroe, Coast Guard Monroe earning the medal, or later awarded the Medal of Honor, and the whole battalion was almost cut off to be isolated. So in the first Battle of Matanikau, they did a small amphibious assault at Cucambana. Second Battle of Matanikau, they did one at here. But the Marines were very, well, that was their forte, as you know. They loved to do it. But I think Patch was the one reluctant. He later did in late January, they did one. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Pete. But yeah, that's I think the more the Army were reluctant than the Marines.
That's a good segue. The next question is, can you comment on why Patch is so poorly known? After all, he was in charge of for most of Guadalcanal and then had so much success in Europe. Can you comment on the strategy and procedures that led to victory on the island?
Yeah, so I encourage you to really get my second book, because I go in a lot of detail there. It focuses on the U.S. Army, especially Patch and what they did in November, December, January, and February. So I think Patch, yeah, for Guadalcanal, I can't really talk about. I know he did quite well in Europe. He ended up being the 7th Army commander. He was a great division commander and corps commander. He was a corps commander. They initiated the 14th or started the 14th Corps in January 43 in Guadalcanal, because that stage he had like 50,000 men underneath him. So I think Patch, why he's not really known for Guadalcanal, it's like, why isn't the Army well known for Guadalcanal? Kind of goes back to what I said from the very beginning, that at the time, the Marines, and there was a Marines Navy fight, which they carried a lot of the heavy weight. Initially, they held out valiantly, and plus two, they were in the press at the time about the Marines' valiant fight, or fight at Guadalcanal. If it was the only real fight in the war at the time for the Americans, so all the focus started to go on Guadalcanal. So the Marines and Navy were in the papers, and then after November, after the Battle of Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, they thought, well, the Marines left, and potentially we have this wrapped up. So the press coverage went somewhere else. And then the Army, when they didn't really get much press coverage after that. And then when after the war, the Marine veterans and the newsletters and the movies and the media and everything popularized this Guadalcanal with the Marines and Navy, it's got pushed out. I think you'll see that in the greater Pacific. And now we're starting to see more and more the Army getting recognized for their good efforts in the Pacific. Here I am, a Marine, saying this, but you know, but yeah. So I think Patch goes along with that. He was kind of relegated to the whole Army scheme, and then I think when he went to Europe, he was kind of pushed to the side because you had other more, I guess, flamboyant top Army leaders who would gather the press. I don't think he was like a press gathering and promoted himself as much. So that's my take on it.
Nice. Jim, if you want to ask your question, then I'll go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
Yeah, thank you, David. Don't apologize for your accent. They always say that about us New Yorkers. You know, they always say stuff that we have hybrid accents too.
That's right.
So
They have an
yeah, and you know, Alabama always has a good accent. Anyway, you know, Zimmerman, of course. You know, I always remember when I read Zimmerman's official history of the Marines in Guadalcanal. It sort of blew my mind because it got into Matanikau in great detail, and and I'm wondering what are the most significant things that jump in your mind when you began to actually examine the terrain. Because I had a friend of mine who he did his national service in Australia in the colonial police and was in the Solomons, but he never spent time down in Guadalcanal. He always was further north on the islands, further north of Guadalcanal, where of course, we've had pretty tough fights against the Japanese. So that would be one question, the terrain issue. And secondly, I've always been fascinated, and I know this doesn't deal with the Matanikau, it deals with the issue of what's happening on the eastern flank. But I was fascinated that Colonel Achiki thought he could basically rout the Marines with that regiment or battalion. Before he comes in with a battalion, then he was going to have a follow-on with a couple of other battalions to fill out the whole 28th Regiment. But just comment on that, sort of the cockiness the Japanese had towards actually confronting the Marines for the first time, at least in that situation where they felt they could destroy them so quickly with a very small force.
Yeah, so my book, actually, chapter 1, I go in quite a bit of detail about how the Japanese, their intelligence and what they were trying to do to gather intelligence on the Marines landing. Initially, they knew that roughly there was a Marine division there because they could count the transports, and that was the intelligence coming back. But they knew after the Battle of Savo Island on the 9th of August, the transports pulled out. So they thought, well, and they went to the Imperial Japanese Army counterparts, and they said, how many men could you land? And once again, I covered this in my book. How many men could you land in this time period? And they said, about 3,000. And they said, good. So we roughly, they thought there were about 2,500 to 3,000 Japanese. The Imperial General Headquarters come up with that number. There was other intelligence agents or agencies, say in the 8th Fleet in Rabaul, who reckoned there was 7,000. And then the number came down about 2,500 to 3,000. But they thought they were being stranded because the transports pulled out. They were stranded. They were potentially doing a large raid, and they were stranded. But the Japanese, the garrison, and I go in a lot of detail in my book, once again, they didn't have radio contact. So they're using the innovative techniques. They're using semaphore flags to these submarines. And you'll see in the first days of the campaign, the Marines talk about submarines popping up, and they're exchanging some gunfire with them, deck guns and 75 millimeters and mortars and all kind of stuff you read about. But these submarines were gathering intelligence, they had planes flying over trying to gather intelligence, and their intelligence basically said the American listless and despondent. So I won't go into a lot of detail about Chiki, but the Chiki battle isn't as straightforward as a lot of people think. I highly recommend my friend's book, William Barsh. Some of you might know him, Bill Barsh. He wrote a very detailed book on the Battle of Alligator Creek. To me, it's the definitive account. It's called Victory Disease or Victory Fever. But the Chiki wasn't even there when the first assault happened. He was in the second. He had his columns like the Japanese do, columns of companies. He was in the second company. And the Marine seen the Japanese coming. They fired on them and went across the sandbar at Alligator Creek. And the first Japanese platoon seen them. They didn't know the Marines were actually there. They thought they were a bit closer to the airfield. So they were somewhat lost. So they went across the mouth and they got hit. They pulled back. The battalion commander went up. He got killed. And then they sent another company over, and Achiki had actually arrived on the scene. He said, "What do we have?" And he says, "We got these guys here." And one of his company commanders said, "Look, I think we need to wait till we get our machine guns and our couple of 70mm guns ready to go to fire for support." And Achiki goes, "Look, pitch black. We don't know what we got. The Americans there, let's force them across the river with his second column. They got wiped out." And then he brought his support up. So it was kind of like a meeting engagement went bad. Now, I say in my book, on the Battle of Second Matanikau, I call it the reverse Alligator Creek, because what we see there, we see an American battalion commander, Lewis Puller, who's in temporary command of 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, sends 2 waves of the Marines across the mouth of Matanikau against fixed machine gun positions. He was basically doing the same thing Achiki was doing, but he at least stopped and pulled back. And I call it the reverse Alligator Creek. And that's something I bring in my book that a lot of people don't really know about. I mean, you speak to the veterans of 2-5, well, most of them are passed away, unfortunately, but you read their accounts. They don't like Puller whatsoever because him, and that's tragic in my book. You read it, it's a very harrowing account. But yeah, that goes back to that. So I think Achiki at that stage had bitten off more than his chew, and he just tried to push through. He should have waited for his second echelon, because his orders was to go there, to attack and seize if he felt he could, or to hold on and conduct, and I got in my book, harassment type operations against the airfield until the rest of them would land. So
Interesting. What pops up with you terrain when you began to actually walk the ground? What sort of blew your mind when you went through the terrain?
Well, I was on operation, so what blew my mind was the steepness of those hills and the heat, because you got 90% humidity, 10 degrees below the equator, that direct sunlight. And you will see in my book how these guys suffered from heat casualty so bad. That terrain, especially those coral ridges, is straight up, and that jungle is very thick. And you can see how the Marines used it, and I'll talk about it there, how they used it to terrain to their advantage as an ally. I mean, it was terrain would be their friend and terrain would be their enemy on both sides. And the Japanese techniques of infiltration, Vandergrift really used that southern flank. You'll see in the Battle of Henderson Field, that thick jungle, to basically channelize and attrit the Japanese forces and put them piecemeal so they could deal with them. And that's when you see the John Basilone and Puller's and actions down about Henderson Field in October. The whole Japanese division attacked them, but that terrain actually funneled them into avenues of approach, which the Marines took advantage of. So that was
Well, thank you. And of course, Hannikin is a very interesting commander. But anyway, thanks a lot. I'll look forward to looking at the book.
No problem, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Okay. Yeah, so I can ask kind of first question is are there any officers on either side that you kind of feel have been unfairly blamed for how the battle went, and that of by previous historians? Yeah, thanks.
Good question. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of what level commanders. I mean, I'll talk about a few battalion commanders in there. The Japanese, one of the Japanese commander, I go back to Kawaguchi. He was blamed for not fighting the Battle of Edson's Ridge quite well, and I don't think he had a good plan, and he wasn't going to do what Achiki was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, last question, the terrain, he underestimated the terrain, but then what he did at the second Battle of Matanikau, he moved his forces quite well and defeated the Americans, which the Japanese didn't really move their forces that fast. He defeated the Americans, so he's always got a bad rap. In fact, he was sent off the island. The Japanese high command didn't like him because he had a tendency to talk a bit. And in the Philippines, he refused to kill some Philippine judges and other government officials.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of got him off track with the Japanese high command. So I think on the Japanese side, that American side, I think most of the commanders, if they've got a bad route, no, I'll take it back. There's a guy called, on the Army side, there's a guy called Lieutenant Colonel, he's a major then, Arthur Timbo of the 164th Regiment. He was the 2nd Battalion commander. He was relieved of duty for not relieving one of his company commanders in the Battle of Coley Point. Now, I don't talk about Battle of Coley Point that much in this first book. Second book, I talk about it quite a bit. I go a lot of detail. But he was relieved of command. There was another battalion commander. He was the colonel. I'm trying to think of his name, of the 132nd Regiment, and he was relieved of command. Said he was sick. I think he got a bad route. But yeah, Timbo, some of the Army guys, they relieved them quite a lot. They relieved 2 Army regimental commanders on Guadalcanal. In September of 42, I call it, like I said before, the purges, September purges, where Vandergrift relieved a lot of his commanders.
Right.
For due reason. I mean, Colonel Hunt, who was the commander of 5th Marines. Yeah, I think he might have got a bad rap, but I think Vandergrift was just getting rid of the people that he knew weren't performing. And that was Hunt was a real good friend of his. But like Edson said, this is real killing business, and we needed to, put in up who knew how to fight and put the personal friendships aside. So yeah.
Yeah, wonder if you could say more about that the big tank attack by the Japanese you mentioned. Why their tanks didn't go? Is it the terrain or maintenance issues, or all of the above? Thanks.
Yeah, so I got a lot of detail in the book, and you'll see when I talk about. Well, they got their newsletters. There's only like seven that lived in the company, and initially they did some probing attacks. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the probing attacks a couple of days before was, 1, to find out what the American anti-tank capability was, and 2, to find out if the sandbar would actually support the weight. And they found out, yes, American had anti-tank defenses there, and 2, the wasn't as great to support the weight as they wanted. And the Captain Mieta, went to Major General Sumiyoshi, who was the actual diversionary attack commander of the force, and said, look, why don't we use infantry to go first, and then we'll follow on with filleting tactics or flaying tactics. Say the Japanese were go straight down the road and on the avenue communication line. Why don't we do that? And Sumiyoshi told Mieta, he goes, no, you're in the plan. The plan said you're going to lead. We're not changing the plan. You have the honor of leading the assault. So from what I gather, you'll notice only 1 tank made it to the other side. They had 9 tanks then to attack, and I calculated probably about 5 bogged down or got stuck in the sand. And then the anti-tank guns, and I can't verify it, but I'm very, very highly sure that one of the improvised anti-tank mines took out 1 tank, and the rest were taken out by anti-tank fire. You read some accounts, artillery took them out, which is not correct, because the artillery was landing a good 100 to 200 yards behind, taking out those supporting columns, because artillery's not going to land at the mouth, because you had Marines right at the mouth. So yeah, but those anti-tank guns took them out very quickly. 37 millimeters went straight through them. So there were top 93s and 95s. There were light tanks and medium tanks.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you think it would have been any different if they had got into the lines, or it was bound to fail?
Yeah, if they got in lines, they had 1 company going with them, and then had a few companies behind them, but the artillery took out supporting companies. 1 company made it over the sandbar with them, but they were cut up by machine gun fire, mortar fire. And then they'd be basically left unsupported. The 1 tank, it did go across. It went on a bunker, machine gun bunker, and crushed the bunker. It mounted like a seawall, went on and crushed the bunker. The Marines went out. I have their accounts. Crushed the gun. They later recovered one of those guns, oiled it up, and it kept firing. So they said, well, they loved John Browning after that. But it mounted the seawall, mounted the bunker, and got stuck. And one of the Marines, see Champagne, took a grenade and stuck in a dolly wheel and disabled the tank, which allowed that half track to come out and fire a few rounds into it. but that was the only tank that made it. So if the other 9 would have made it over, well, yeah, might have penetrated through, because there's only one small road. They couldn't get through the jungle, and they would have been down that road. It would have took them out.
Right. Thanks, Dave. I look forward to reading the book.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, you'll have to excuse me. I came in late. I was at a funeral, but there is a question that came up during the last part. 2 questions actually, and during the Q&A, it seems to me that you suggested that a lot of the reason that the battle isn't well known has to do with basically public relations, or basically who got the most press. And well, I was wondering, since a lot of history is told by who controlled the press and who controlled the public's access to information, if you think there were anything going on, between the Marines and the Army, between certain commanders, which we know people like George Patton and Bernard Montgomery did, who was fighting over publicity. Was there some sort of battle going on there between specific people as to who would get the publicity, kind of an inter-service rivalry? And the second question would be, from everything I've read about Guadalcanal, it was a fait accompli. The Japanese, in the long run, could never win, and the idea was that what specifically were the commanders who were there trying to, I mean, if they were aware of that, if the commanders on the ground, the Japanese commanders on the ground in the field were aware of that, and if so, what were they trying to accomplish? That's 2 separate questions. Sorry if it was overly complex.
No, the first one, rivalry. I mean, yeah, you had the Navy against the Army. Obviously, you had King, Ernest King, you had Nimitz, and you had MacArthur. So MacArthur at that time was the Southwest Pacific commander, and he was in Australia. And you had Nimitz, or Gormley at that stage, and later Halsey. Nimitz was the Pacific commander, Halsey, and Gormley was the South Pacific commander. So you had before the invasion, because Guadalcanal was Operation Pestilence in 3 phases. So phase 1, what they did, they moved the boundary line, so to speak. So it took it out of MacArthur's theater and gave it to Gormley Navy Theater. So you always had those 2 organizations kind of fighting for publicity. So the Marines at the time they're really, well, still are part of the Navy, but they were kind of linked in with that Navy publicity, if you want to have that publicity war with the Army. And but the Marines, they thought when they were going to land, and they were told, and even Millard Harmon, which is the Army commander in the South Pacific, and even King knew that as soon as they landed, they would be there for maybe a few weeks, move out, and then the Army would come in and garrison. In fact, I just read some stuff not too long ago. The New Zealand troops were initially going to come in and garrison. That would have been a big what if. And the Marines were going to move over and assault another island, but that didn't come to be because there was no resources. They were guarding all the Army resources at that stage, were guarding that vital Australian-American supply line down in the South Pacific. So, yeah, so that's why the Army didn't get a show very initially in it. But I think it goes back to that question. I think it was mainly Navy and Army fighting for publicity at the time. So the second part of the question, the Japanese, and you'll see in my book, they never gave up. The guys on the ground never gave up. They always kept fighting because you had the first convoy came in August, September. Then they knew it was going to be a major, long struggle. Imperial General Headquarters, they said, okay. So that's why after September, they stopped the Papua New Guinea campaign the offensive, put them on hold, and all the reinforcements, all the supplies went straight into Guadalcanal because that was their main goal then, to take out the Americans of Guadalcanal. And then you see the October transports, October offensive, and then they were defeated, and then they were going for a November offensive with that would have been a massive assault And as we know, it was defeated in the naval battles of Guadalcanal. It sunk a lot of their transports before they could get there. And then even after that, Hayakitake, which is the Japanese Lieutenant General, 17th Army commander on the island, basically said, we're going to go into a holding action, and we're waiting for more reinforcements. And that's what they were doing. They fighting a holding action, starving, literally starving to death. Supplies would hardly coming in. They were waiting for further reinforcements. It wasn't until December the 31st that the Japanese, after going to the Emperor, made it official that we're going to evacuate Guadalcanal. And even the guys at the very end, because they didn't tell the soldiers that you're evacuating because they'd killed themselves. So what they said was, we're going to move back to Cape Esperance in the northwest part of the island. There we're going to dig in and form a holding action and wait for the reinforcements to continue the assault. And I've got one account by one Japanese lieutenant. He didn't know when they were getting on the evacuation on the 7th of February, when they're getting on the ship, they told him, we're going to do one last assault like bonsai kamikaze assault on the Lunga perimeter. It wasn't until he boarded the ship and he seen a Navy captain or officer in white said, welcome aboard, thank you for what you've done. And then he knew that they're sailing away. But yeah, they never gave up on the guys on the island.
And they had no conception of it. And do you think that in particular, Richard Tregaskis' book, obviously, which was probably the most famous one at the time about Guadalcanal, and the Hollywood movie, obviously, you think that also, because they saw the Marines as something to play up more, especially in the film, because they were the Marines or something like that. Do you think that had a lot to do with the public perception?
Yes, it
at
did.
the time?
Book come out in 43, and I don't know how many people spoken to. He said, I first learned about Guadalcanal through reading Guadalcanal Diary. And that, in fact, that's an example of, if you see the movie, the Marines go in, they take the island, and at the very end, they've won, and they see some Army guys coming in, and that's it. And that's the perception. And that probably did a lot to form the American perception, that movie and that book. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's just one great example of how the perception of the Guadalcanal Campaign went down to the public. And that's a good book at the time. I mean, obviously it's got some errors in it, but remember, he's writing contemporary. I've used a few examples in my book on Tregaskis, and he's writing from what he knew at the time. And I think it's very accurate from what he knew at the time. I highly recommend that book. But yeah, that's a good point, Mike.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Great talk. What I saw. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
thanks, Mike. Dave, I just wanted to ask you one question before we conclude. I read the Marines really went.
Yeah.
The Marines went out of the way to record the dead and bury them, and specifically where they were buried, so they could come back and essentially give them a more proper burial back in the U.S. And I know that process is still going on. I'm just curious, are there still attempts to find the MIA or the killed in action over there? And given the terrain and everything, it must be very difficult, and the time that's passed.
Yeah. So yeah, the Marines recorded as best they could. They did a lot of battlefield burials. They had a map called Map 104, which is basically a rough map. They made it at the time off an aerial map, and they just annotated it down. In fact, it has clouds over some of it. There was a thing where Puller said one time, he goes, "Where are you?" He goes, "I'm in a cloud," when he radioed back. But yeah, they have something called the DPAA, which is an American group based out of Hawaii. You might be familiar with some of their great work. Their American defense, American military, and they go out around the world looking for American missing. They do some great work, and they go every year to Guadalcanal. I remember in 2019, I was with them on a couple of dig sites, and they were locating remains. And they locate remains all the time. It's just that once they locate the remains, they have to go back, be processed in their lab in Hawaii, and that's a long process to confirm. They use DNA and all kind of other sources. So there's, I think, last count on land, there's about 300 to 400 missing Americans on Guadalcanal. American, so it's Navy, Army, and Marines. A lot of them are in the Matanikau area. By my count, 60 to 70 in the Matanikau area. You'll see like the whole Getty Patrol, then you got the second battle. There's a whole, there's a lot of Americans still there, but there are efforts every year to try to find them. And the locals do find them from time to time. And there's been some good education campaigns about if you do come across bones. You can imagine there's a lot of Japanese bones located there. So
Yeah.
they're trying to educate the locals. You know, some of the locals, third world country, would be digging a hole. There's some remains. They'll either throw them in the trash, or they was digging another and throwing the bones in there because they don't know what the bones mean. To them, they don't know what the war means other than unexploded ordnance. And unfortunately, that's a real danger over there.
Yeah, thankful. Thank you. That was wonderful, as was the talk. And that concludes our talk for today. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Guadalcanal's Longest Fight: The Pivotal Battles of the Matanikau by David Holland. Please join us next Saturday, April 18th at 1 p.m. when historian John McManus will discuss his book, The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach, which covers the 1st Division of Omaha Beach. I think John has spoken to us at least once or twice. He's a great historian. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing everyone at our next talk. Until then, take care. And Dave, thanks so much for your time and being flexible with respect to your schedule. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.